walking through the life of David, and we are in his later years. David is above 60 years old now, and we are seeing these last kind of recorded events in David's life. We've presented all these messages under the title of Real Life, Real Faith, because David shows us what that looks like. People go in and out. When am I saved? Am I not saved? Is faith just supposed to mean everything is supposed to be good? Are the televangelists true that no Christian's ever supposed to be sick or have problems in their family or never have to have bills due or anything like that? My friend, all that is, from Georgia, we called it baloney. Now, everybody calls it whatever they want, and that's what we called it, baloney. Because when you watch David, you get to see a man for chapter after chapter, what a man who we know authenticated by God himself as a man of faith. And yet, my friend, faith is not some straight line up. There's a whole lot of ups and downs in between. And David's life is really divided into two. There is before Bathsheba and there's after Bathsheba. And the stories could not be more dramatically told. And so we're seeing many of the play out of David's horrific decisions in his life. And so I want to read to you the beginning of chapter 15, and Lord willing, we're going to try to get through some chapters, all right? So let's read verse 1. And it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. This is kind of a man promoting himself. All the chariots and the horses, a man that's being promoted among the citizenry. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man had a controversy, they came to the king for judgment. Then Absalom, calling unto him, said, of what city are you from? And he said, Your servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See that matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear you. In other words, if you're waiting to see the king, nobody's you're going to have a long time getting your hearing. And Absalom said, Moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which had any suit or cause might come to me, and I would do him justice. Do you hear his self-promotion? Sound like a politician, right? These guys right here, they do it all wrong, but boy, you put me in, I'm going to bring change. Verse 5, And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. Here he is warming up to the people. And on this manner Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. That's an emphatic statement that categorizes what's going on. He stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it came to pass after 4 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray you let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I abode in Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. It's amazing what Absalom's about to do in betraying his father and overthrowing his kingdom, and he's doing it all under a religious guise, talking about his vows and the Lord and serving God. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went into the simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel and the Gileadite, and David's counselor from his city, which from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong. For the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him in Jerusalem, Arise, let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. He lays this out, and then you'll begin to see their fold out. Let me read verse number 23. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. Now verse 30. And David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olivet, and wept as he went. And he had his head covered, and he went barefoot. And all the people that was with him covered every man his head. And they went up weeping as they went up. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray you turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount, where he worshiped God, Behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. May God Almighty teach us His truth tonight. I want to preach to you in these series of chapters 15 through 18 under the subject matter of tested by fire. You can't read, no wonder when you read the Psalms, they're all about fighting externally, battling internally. Paul or David writing out and crying desperately for God's help and His wisdom to navigate the terror that's all around him. David lived on a battlefield. I mean, he lived on the literal battlefield of dealing with not only the giants of Gath, but he dealt with all of that running from Saul and surviving in the wilderness. And then as soon as he's crowned, he's dealing with outside battles. And so all of those going through, though, you always read those lists of battles with almost a sense of satisfaction because David's on top. And David's got a good spirit, and he's got a good attitude, and you see this man of faith just warring along. These chapters, in my opinion, record the deepest, darkest time in David's life. Because he's not fighting Saul. He's not fighting Achish, king of Gath. He's warring against his own son, his own family that he loves. I'm telling you, it's probably true with you, as I'm sure it would be for me. There's nothing that'll so touch your soul like battles within your own family. They're in a whole nother category. And so when you see in these chapters, David comes to this place, all you see him doing is weeping and burdened and broken. And so I call this tested by fire. There's going to be quite a number of tests throughout these chapters. But it seems as it plays out the promise that God gave David that his sins were forgiven for Bathsheba, but the sword would pierce through his family. And so David, some would say, David's chickens are coming home to roost. But when you watch David through dealing with a lot of his own reapings of bad moral choices, yet through it all, you still see a man of God facing even his own consequences with choices and a mindset of faith. My mom used to say, son, just take your medicine. That means you've done the wrong. Here's the consequences. Take your medicine. And what we see is David taking his medicine by faith. Let me share with you a few of the fill-ins. You can read these chapters, and I would encourage you to read. They're some of the most fascinating reading and instructive because they're right where we live. But I want to summarize two of the things that David's being tested with, and then we'll get back to where David himself is being tested. First of all, David was being tested by a group of people that I call his foes. Now, what you're going to find out is some of these weren't foes to begin with, or David didn't know they were foes. But it's amazing, and quite often it happens that sometimes the people that you imagine are your friends, when the fire comes, they're exposed really as foes. They never were really with you. They really were just attached. I used to hear people say, the people who you think are friends but walk out of your life, they were never your friends. You ever been told that? Maybe you've told that to your children. And so the reality is you begin to watch these people when David is going through fiery trials. By the way, Peter reminds us we've all got some fiery trials we will also walk through. And so David's going to realize some of his enemies were always his enemies, and some people that he thought were confidants turn out to be part of this coup and this betrayal. The first one is obvious. It's his own son Absalom. Absalom, who we already been reading about his life, where he slew Amnon, his brother, because Amnon slew or raped his sister Tamar. He felt justified in vindicating his sister. He probably had bitterness in his father's heart because he waited 2 years, and David the king should have dealt with it, so Absalom didn't have to deal with it. And then he flees, and then it takes 2 years for his daddy to bring him back home, and so he comes home. And finally, David lets him come home, but David says, "You're not going to see my face. I don't want to see you. I'm forgiving him, but I'm not forgetting." He's went through all that, and now some time has passed away, and all along the way, the wheels have been turning in Absalom's mind about what he'll do. And he not only wants to hurt his father, he wants to kill his father. And he not only wants to kill his father, he wants to take over his kingdom. Imagine that the next time you have a pity party because your kids ain't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Have you been where David's been? And so Absalom, he lurks in the shadows. In fact, what you find out in his life, he's much like the future Antichrist that we read about. He's luring the hearts of the people, right? Oh, if people would just talk to me, I'd be better to them, and I wouldn't be like my father, staying so busy. And so all he's doing, he's downing people to bolster himself. You see people do that on the job place. You see your own kids do that. I've seen people do that in ministry. And so here is Absalom tearing down others to build up himself, and now what he has is a mass of Israelites following him. People that David fought for, people that David risked his life for, people that David spent his life leading, and now they began to be pulled off one by one into Absalom's loyal people. Back in chapter 12, this is what I allude to. I just want you to see the course that's following. Chapter 12, verse number 11. It says, "Thus said the Lord, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them unto your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." What you find is that David did these things secretly with his laying with Bathsheba, killing Uriah. It was all behind. What you're going to find is Absalom comes along, and Absalom's doing everything in plain sight. He rebels against his father. He says, this is coming from this, under this pretense. Isn't it amazing how many people guise evil things under the name of God? Well, we're doing it for God, or this is church. And they attach religion to the ungodly things that they do. And that's the kind of man that Absalom was. And so he goes through, and throughout this thing, you see him outwardly submitting. I came home, Daddy. I stayed in my house, Daddy. Then I came to you. We embrace. Outwardly, he looks like everything's fine, and David's assuming everything's back to normal. But in his heart, he has scandal there. Chapter 14, verse number 33 makes this statement. "So Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called Absalom, he came to the king, bowed himself on his face to the ground of the king. And though he's doing these things outwardly, inside he's mad, inside he's bitter, inside he's resentful." It's like a child. I heard of a little boy one time. He was sent to the corner for his bad behavior, but he was still mad as fire. And so he finally just said, and he says, I'm facing the corner on the inside, but he says, but I'm looking at you on the outside, but I'm looking at you with my tongue out on the inside. And this is where we find Absalom. What you find is that this coup, this trying to attempt to overthrow his father's kingdom, he even goes down and puts David's 10 concubines that David leaves behind to keep the city while they escape. He puts them all on the roof, and Absalom sleeps with all 10 of David's concubines in the public scene. See, God told him, you did it secretly, but your revenge is coming, your penance is coming through public disgrace. So when you look through this, you begin to see how ugly this is. We read last week, if you remember, I told you to remember how Solomon had that big old lock of beautiful hair, and he took that once a year as a big community event where they would come and watch Solomon, this good-looking fella, have his hair cut publicly. And they said they pulled off him 5 pounds of hair. When you read chapter 18, you're going to find out the battles come to David. Absalom's after him, and Absalom's on a mule, and he runs underneath a thicket that's coming out of a large oak, and it catches that hair of his. It catches that hair, and his animal runs on. He's suspended between heaven and earth, caught in that tree, and Joab comes along and kills him. It's the irony, right? All his pride and all of his self-attention and all his manipulations, and lo and behold, it was that hair that killed him. It's unbelievable how often the irony and the poetry sometimes of vengeance that comes about in a person's life that really reminds you it's not on accident at all. And when Absalom died, you can read chapter 18. Listen to how David, when he catches the news, it's one of the saddest pictures in the Bible. When his son David finds out that he's died, here's what David does in verse 33. And the king was much moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went thus, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God that I had died for you, O Absalom, my son, my son." What a memorable desperation of David and deep sorrow. Like the sorrow of so many, like Jacob when he thought that Joseph had died and been torn by an animal, he despaired and he says, "I'll go to my grave mourning." Here David, imagine what all is going on in his heart. Maybe he's running through the myriad of questions that someone would run through after having lost a child. And here he is mourning and deeply moved at the loss of his son. It's remarkable, that statement that he made, "Would to God that I had died for you." When I read that, it's a sad thing to look upon a father who was in such a helpless state he could not save his son, only to make me reflect on the great Heavenly Father that you and I have. That's the heart of God who saw us in our sin, dying one by one on our way to an eternity separated from Him. And our God who mourned, He doesn't find no pleasure in the death of the wicked. It's not God's pleasure to send men to hell. It was God's pleasure to come and die for His people, that we could be forever saved. And so Absalom, it's a mess to watch him through these episodes. But then came David's foe in Ahithophel. So David's lost his son, he's lost his people, they're against him. And then here comes Ahithophel. I'm telling you, Ahithophel is particularly paid note in this whole drama. Because as you'll read, Ahithophel was David's most trusted counselor and friend, he's called. And Ahithophel becomes David's Judas. When Absalom goes and begins to start this coup, and so all of these Israelites start going, and here comes Ahithophel to support Absalom and rebelling and betraying David, his king. Now, why would he do that? I mean, he could sit back and say, is there any particular purpose? Is there any reason that Ahithophel would have betrayed him? Well, we don't know all the specific reasons, but when you begin to read through those genealogies, you get to Ahithophel and you find out one important truth, that he was the grandfather of Bathsheba. So here's David's ruined her marriage, ruined her life, slew his son-in-law. And you began to wonder if that didn't just stay with him and never leave him. And if he ever had a chance, I mean, he can't contest great King David, but if there was ever a chance he could pull the knife and show some revenge, maybe it's this very time. I want to tell you what, it's hard to describe this, but David writes it in about 5 or 6 different Psalms. This hurt David. Listen to it in Psalms 41, verse 9. David writes, "Yea, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." David said in Psalms 55:12, "For it was not an enemy that reproached me." He says, "Or I could bear it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was you, a man, my equal, my guide, my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together. We walked into the house of God in company. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick to hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings among them." This hurt him. Ahithophel lived like Judas, and it's interesting, he died like Judas. You're going to read how Ahithophel is so full of himself. When you get to chapter 17, what you find that Ahithophel was this great counselor. When he agreed to follow Absalom in this coup, he was trusted. It's stated in these verses that when Ahithophel gave counsel, it was as if God Himself spoke. Well, we read a while ago. Remember when David says God turned the counsel of Ahithophel? Well, Absalom calls the court. He's trying to figure out, how do I go and deal with my father and kill him and restore Israel to myself? How do I do that? And Ahithophel says, here's what you do. Get on the road. Take a small band of 12,000 men, and we're going to go after him while he's on the run, and we're going to destroy him. And it just happened that Hushai, there's a friend of David that comes along as well, Hushai, and he asks Hushai. Hushai gives a different counsel. He says, "No, I'll tell you, we need to wait and just let him go. Let's gather all of Israel, and we'll make sure we destroy him as a family, as a whole group, and then all of Israel will be yours. Absalom, you know what, Hushai? I like your advice better than Ahithophel. You know what Ahithophel did? The Bible says he got on his donkey, went home, got everything in order, and he hung himself. Just like a Judas. Always more important. Even Judas could have bowed the knee, but instead of bowing the knee, Judas rather die than give his allegiance to the King Christ. And so there's Ahithophel. You find Ziba. Ziba is a man, maybe you remember the story of Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth is one of those that David said, I just want to show grace to somebody. Remember that story? And so they went and found one of Saul's sons, and they brought Ahithophel. He's a lame man, and David said, I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be a son to me. And he gave Ziba, which was a servant of Saul. He said, I'm giving you Ziba, the servant, his family, all the stuff is yours, Mephibosheth. Well, when David is going out of town, here comes Ziba, and he's got some refreshments for David. Oh, you can just see him. He's giving these things. And David says, well, where's your master? Where's Mephibosheth? He said he was glad the kingdom was about to be restored to Saul. He's glad you're gone. We find out later there's two sides of that story. And so, but he was betraying David as well, lying, bringing confusion in between the two. And then Shimei, he's kind of a highlight when you read of him in chapter 16, verse 5 through 9. In fact, just look at chapter 16, verse number 13. This gives you a little bit of the idea of what's going on with Ziba. This is a son, a descendant from Saul, who always still resented David's authority. And here's what it says in chapter 16, verse number 13. It says, David and his family and his people were leaving. It says, as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along on the hillside over against him and cursed as he went and threw stones at him and cast dust. So here David is. Remember we just read him? He's going out, he's brokenhearted, he's hurt, he's barefooted, he's broken. And what does he have but this descendant of Saul who's throwing rocks and cursing his name like he's a dog? You better be glad that David was in a good state of mind, because Abishai said, David, let me go take his head off. And David denied him. Shimei, here he is. He's kicking David while he's down. Can a man be more desperate, more hurt, more humiliated? And you know what? When David comes back, you'll find, just to tell you ahead of the story, when David comes back, when Absalom's dead and David comes back to Jerusalem, he sees Shimei, and Shimei is begging for mercy, as a man would. David showed him mercy. David says, I'm not going to kill you. But when Solomon was coming along, David was on his deathbed, and Solomon's going to be the new king. He says, I want you to remember Shimei. You can't trust him. And so Solomon told him, says, when he came before the king, he said, I'm not going to kill you. My father didn't kill you. I'm not going to kill you. But don't you leave Jerusalem. You stay right here. Don't you ever leave. And one day, some of his servants or cattle got away, and he left town to go retrieve them. And he did retrieve them. But Solomon heard that he left the town. He come and he says, hey, I just had to go after my stuff. And Solomon says, you've sealed your doom. And he had him executed. David's tested foes. That's the thing about relationships with people. You don't have to wonder whether you can trust somebody. You'll experience that one day or another. But I tell you, along the way, with David hurting so bad and all these people turning on him, his own people, his own flesh and blood, his own best friend and counselor, and then these other two. In the midst of that, though, something burst forth with some light. That David didn't just have some foes that were tested, but he had his friends that were tested. David had four sections of men. A total of 6 people show up in David's darkest hour just to bless him. It's one thing for a guy or you to call somebody a friend. You'll know they're a friend when they show up in your darkest hour. When they show up without all the condemnation, without all this or that, they just stuck through you through thick and through thin, or the people that call friends when you really need them, but they got too many other things to do. But then you got those certain people. They may be small in number. If we're honest and we begin to think about the value of true, deep friendships, they are a few. Here they are in David's life. Here David's leaving with his friends, and so they're running out to meet him as he leaves. and the servants of his household, they're leaving with him. In fact, in chapter number 15, in verse number 15, it says this, "And the king's servant said unto the king, Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king shall appoint." That's some pretty good friends. David, we're not fighting for our lives. We're staying with you. You tell us what you want. You tell us what you need. Tell us. Boy, a great sentiment among friendships. See, friendships are essential. We went through a whole study on friendships a couple of years ago. Did a lot of research on it. It's not just biblical, my friend. It's psychological. Every psychiatrist will teach you having friendships is not only important, it's essential. It's essential to your mental health. It's essential to your physical health. And so many people stay Lone Ranger, so-called Christians, and they never join themselves and become a regular part of the church, and yet they wonder why they're missing out on all the benefits promised in the Bible. Well, they come in the body. And so they're essential, and they take energy, right? I mean, friendships take a little work, and some friendships takes a whole lot of work. I mean, they just are. They're hard work. But you remember this, when you're laboring for friendships and you're putting up with people's problems, they're putting up with some of your problems, and some of them are a little more higher maintenance than the others, the reality is it'll always be worth it. Because we call it cultivating relationships, right? Well, cultivating is the hardest part of farming. It's working and toiling that ground and putting in the time and the energy, and then ultimately they are powerfully effective. Proverbs 18:24 tells us about developing those relationships. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about you better be careful about those friendships, right? Because wise men are going to walk with wise men, and companions of fools, they're going to affect your life. And so bad company corrupts good morals. Friends affect friends. Iron sharpens iron, same concept. And so we have to choose that body of friends closely. So let me give you David's real quickly. Verse number 21, we find of a man named Ittai. He says in chapter 15, verse number 21, this is all as David is leaving home. And Ittai answered the king and said, As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be. God, give us at least one friend like that. Amen. David says, no, you go back home, Ittai. This ain't your fight. This ain't your problem. You go back home. He said, I ain't going nowhere without you. Whether I live or die, I'm your friend. I'm going to stick with you to the end. Man alive. Then you got Zadok and Abiathar. This is, these high priests in their ministry in the temple. And so they're coming out. They take the ark outside Jerusalem. They're just following David. They said, we're going where the presence of God going. He's following that man. And David turns to Zadok and Abiathar, marvels over their steadfast friendship. And he sends them back, says, take the ark back. Go back. In fact, while you're there, y'all can be ears for me, and you can send your boys. He talks about Ahimaaz and Jonathan. He says, you got these two boys there, and if you hear some news, you can get to me. Send me the message out. Verse 27 says this, And the king said unto Zadok the priest, Are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your two sons with Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, your son of Abiathar. And he says, listen, when I'm out in the wilderness, if you got a word, send your boys out and bring me word. And they did. In fact, they were going back to be ears so that they could pass along warnings and say, David, here's what's happening. Watch out this and be careful. Isn't that a great, fascinating aspect of friendships? Man, they can watch you six, and they can be helpful in your blind spots, and they can come along and they can warn you of things you don't see. I'm telling you what, I love that God sets things up in the family so that young people have parents, because young people, their hearts are all messed up and all over the place emotionally, and a parent's there to say, hey, you ain't seeing this thing right. And then you get those friends that come along, and man, life, it's good when you get a friend that says, you better watch that right there. Because you don't always like to hear that. But if you got a friend, you know, I can trust their heart, even though I don't understand. I can't see what they're seeing. But man, they give you some great vantage points. Man, I'm thankful. There's been friends I've had, and I've been a friend to others that have saved both of us from driving off a cliff with our lives. And so here they are, these wonderful ones, and they risk their lives to do it. You'll find as they send them out, these boys were nearly caught and would have been executed. Instead, they risked their lives to get these messages and warnings to David. Then there's Hushai. We just talked about him a while ago. We find him. He comes out. He's called in the Bible, he's called David's friend. And these others are definitely acting in the role, but he's actually called David's close friend and confidant. And so you read about him, but you see him in verse number 31, a verse that kind of summarizes him. It says, "And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David says, I pray you turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Well, guess what friend's going to answer that call? Hushai comes out to David, and David says, "Hey man, you go. Just as you've been a friend of me, you go back and you remain in Jerusalem." So he does. He walks up into the throne room with Absalom, and he says, "Are you betraying your long term friendship, David?" He says, "I serve the king. I serve the one who has God's favor on it in Jerusalem." And so he stayed among the friend, and it was Hushai that God actually used to give that counsel to save David and bring the very confusion that David prayed for upon Ahithophel's counsel. What a friend. What a friend. See, a lot of friends are just fair weather, right? Fair weather friend, what does that mean? It means they're fine as long as you got, I can come over to your house, borrow your truck, use your chainsaw, right? That's all good. But the fair weather friends, when there's risk, there's challenge, and I'm not getting anything, they leave. Here's Hushai putting himself right in there to stand for David. Sometimes, man, when your back's against the wall and you think all these people are going to stand for you and speak for you and support you, you'll find, my friend, many times they're like rats jumping overboard. I've seen it in churches. I've seen it in families. But old Hushai goes in as a voice for David. And then finally, you see these friendship in verse number 29. You see these friends come up, Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. Barzillai, we could spend a whole message beautiful in Barzillai's life. He was a true friend to David, and David was a true friend to him. And when you read in chapter 17, verse 27 through 29, you read about them because they come out and they bring beds and food galore because they see David hurting, and they bring him all these refreshments. Now watch how verse 29 summarizes this. God help us be good at what these three friends were good at. It says they brought beds, basins, earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched corn, beans, lentils, parched pulse, verse 29, and honey and butter and sheep and cheese of kine for David and for the people that were with him to eat. Watch what it says. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Before they got to David, they realized they sure must be tired. They sure must be wore out. They sure must be hungry. They sure must need some of these things. They didn't see it. They didn't know it. But I want to tell you what they recognize with compassion. If I was in that, I'd be tired. I'd be hungry. And so this idea, this thoughtfulness of refreshments was due to perceived needs. When you got some friends, my friend, you get to knowing them. I remember when I was doing some of those research on friendships, and there was this article in the newspaper at the same time, and they were magnifying what they called on my way friends. That's what the article, on my way friends. And the article went that a lady called her three friends, three of her girlfriends. They lived in another state, and she was just telling them about the rough day that she was having. She'd had some a trauma, some tragedy in her home and family, and so it was just getting out of that. And one morning she was just talking to a friend, and said, "Hey, I'm just having just one of those rough days today." And all she heard on the other end of the line was, "We're on our way." That's pretty cool when you got friends like that. They perceive your needs. They know the hurts. And man alive, we got people all over this church that are like that. And so we ought to be that. Not just saying, "Hey, well, I'll be there if you ask." And that's sometimes all we can do if somebody asks. But along the way, we can perceive some needs and send those cards or make those visits or carry that food and meet those needs. Thank God. Thank God. Tough times give friends opportunity to shine. But I want to close because David was tested most importantly, not only with his foes and with his friends, but really in his faith. That's who the story is about. How will David face his fiery trial? To me, the greatest trial he's been through to date. How will he deal with that? It seems like this is the darkest hour in David's life. In chapter 15, verse number 23, we'll walk through a few of these statements. Watch how David dealt with it. And I'll show you a man of faith. whose life is not always rainbows and sunshine. He's going through a fiery trial. What does a man of faith do during this time? Well, in chapter 15 and verse number 23, it says, "And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over." Here's David leaving Jerusalem. If you've been to Israel or you've seen pictures of it, you see it. You walk right out of Israel over this little small valley, the Kidron Valley, and you're over on the Mount of Olives. The same path Jesus took. The same path Jesus took in agony when He was rejected by the people in Jerusalem on the triumphal entry. The same way He left out to head out of the city to go to the cross. Here you see David's walking out and heading across the Kidron, again going up this Mount of Olives as he's rejected as well. He's been rejected by his people, and he walks out into the wilderness. Verse number 30 shares with us, as we read, you can tell from the outside what's happening on the inside. Verse 30, "And David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went." This is David. I'm talking the baddest warrior on the planet at the time. And David is broken inside. And it says he wept as he went, and he had his head covered in humility. He went barefoot. Again, all these marks of humbling himself. And all the people that went with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went. A whole group of David and 600 of his friends and family around him, they leave mournful, humiliated, hurting, and weeping. Verse number 25 says this, "And the king said unto Zadok, Carry back the ark into the city, and if I find favor in your eyes of the Lord, He will bring me again and show me both it and His habitation. But if he says this, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good." Kind of hear what's going on in David's thoughts? He says, how am I going to fight this? I've sinned. Good things, as Job says, good things happen, bad things happen. If God's done with me, like He got done with Saul, if He's done with me, well, why would I fight that He's done with me? But if God's gracious and He's using this just in a time of my life and He'll bring me back, then my life is in His hands. I don't know of any better thing. See, David's getting back to that place that he once knew before Bathsheba. He's coming back to that humble place of surrender to God. Greatest thing a man does, the very intent of God in this world is to bring men back to the Garden of Eden where we submit ourselves to Him. David wasn't submissive when he was looking out on Bathsheba. He wasn't submitting himself when he called her to his room. He wasn't submitting to God when he tried to cover up his schemes by killing Uriah. And David is humbled and he throws himself into the hands of God and says, I'm submitting to Him. This trouble, this pain, quite often our first reaction is one of pride. Why me, God? Well, why not you? Hadn't you done enough to deserve some stuff on this planet? Oh, we have, because we deserve hell if we got what we really deserved. It ain't always about God punishing us for something like that, but the least of our exclaims should be for justice, because we're a people that don't want justice. We trust justice took place on Calvary. We want mercy. And David is putting himself in the place of mercy, surrendered to whatever end God has for him. But then watch this. Chapter 16, verse number 10. This is when Shimei, you remember, he's the descendant of Saul, and he's cursing David, calling him all kind of names, throwing rocks at him, throwing dust in the air. Listen to David's response when Shimei or Abishai said, let me go take his head off David. He says in verse number 10, and he also that is violent, whose heart, I'm chapter number 17, chapter 16, verse number 10. And the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord hath said to him, curse, David. Who shall then say, wherefore have you done so? And David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my son, which came forth out of my bowels, seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do to me? Let me alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and the Lord will requite me good for His cursing this day. It's amazing how we fall apart and we've got to bring vindication on everything everybody says. We live like everybody's just watching us. Somebody said, one guy on the football team, he had a hard time going to the football game sitting in the audience because every time a play was over, the team got in a huddle and talked about him. People feel bad. Everybody's talking about me. Everybody's against me. And David says, my own son is trying to undo me. You think this little stuff bothers me? Let him curse. Let him curse. Maybe God will see that and have mercy upon me for that. My friend, it's not in those times of darkness to demand vindication and get in some kind of mindset. I've seen people, whether they've lost family or had hard times, and it turns sometimes even family against each other, against friends, because they're trying to, well, you didn't do this or you did this, and they get into these tizzies. But David sought no retaliation. That's a humble man. That's a broken man. It's a dish rag of a man. And that's where we ought to be, right? I mean, where are you going to be in the darkest times of life? Don't we want God to undergird where we are? I don't want more trouble with God. I don't want putting distance and time between God rescuing me. I want to put myself in His hands, and that's exactly where David did. See, he practiced 1 Peter 3:9 when God wrote to those in the New Testament who are going through difficult times and adversity and oppression. He says, don't render evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that you are thereunto called, and that you should inherit a blessing. Even when that oppression and affliction is coming from the hands of God, God promised in Hebrews chapter 12, they verily for a few days chastened us after our own pleasure. Our parents brought pain to us, but God allows pain for our profit, that we might be partakers of His holiness. Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. God says, don't be so discouraged. Put yourself in my hands. And then verse 31 of chapter 15. I don't know anything more moving in this whole plight. This is strength for my own soul, is what we read in these verses. Chapter 15, verse 31. It says, and one told David about him coming in, and David says, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Verse 32, and it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mountain, where he worshiped God. What do we do on our darkest times? Is it, why me? What have I done? It's people. It's internal. It's self-focused. David, in the midst of all, he did what he did for 70-something Psalms in the middle of your Bible. He stops and he worships. See, worship's not just when you get the promotion. Worship's not just when everything works out according to your prayer life. One of the greatest times of worship is when things don't work out, because that's where faith and trust is most needed and most tested. The fiery trials that Peter talks about are trials to test you. And when you're tested, you'll come forth as gold. In fact, that's exactly the words of Job. We received good things. Here, the first thing he found he did when he understood the death of his children and the absence of all of his wealth and his sickness, he fell on his knees and he worshiped God and said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of God. That's where your faith's tested. Faith ain't always tested in success, though it is success that will test you as well. That's why David fell with Bathsheba, because he failed the test of success. Now he's being tested with suffering. What will he do? Well, the Bible says he falls. He doesn't pull out a sword. He doesn't run to take matters in his own hands. He just falls down to the one great faithful source for all God's people, and that's Him. The Hebrew writer describes this as offering the sacrifice of thanksgiving. It's easy to say, thank you, Lord, for this new baby. Thank you, Lord, for this raise. Thank you, I got to pay off my car. But when there's pain in the life and you offer thanksgiving, that's a sacrifice. It's an offering to a God who's worthy, even though I don't feel it, I only know it. And David worships God. Turn, if you will, to Psalms 3. Psalms 3 was written right here. And it's not only Psalms 3. David wrote a lot of Psalms about this episode. He wrote about it in Psalms 4 and 41 and 55 and 61 through 63. But here gives you a snippet in what's going on in David's heart when he stops at the top of the hill to worship. Listen to what he says. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? And many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield from me, my glory and the lifter of my head. That is my encourager. I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and He heard me out of His holy hill. I laid me down and slept. I awakened, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs unto the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people, Selah. The beginning of that psalm says he wrote it when Absalom turned a coup upon him. I want to close with this final passage, chapter 18, because it brings all this into two bookends of this account. Joab goes out. Absalom comes with this great army. Over time, David had it gave time through Hushai's counsel for David to kind of build up and beef his army a little bit, but they still went out at great odds. But they're forgetting what a bad group of people David had around him. All them warriors. Joab, you don't want to mess with Joab. He will mess you up. And Joab goes out and leads, and they defeat them. And once they kill Absalom, everybody else loses heart and goes home. And here's what you read in chapter 18 about this battle in verse number 6. It says, so the people went into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim, where the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David, and there was a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. For the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country, and the wood devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. What does that mean? It means here they go out against all kind of odds, but David's men win again. And he throws in that phrase, and the woods destroyed more men than the sword. That means it wasn't just Joab and his army slaying these Israelites who had rebelled. It was slime pits. It was trees like with Absalom. It was all these obstructions that they're dealing with, just the kind of dispersion of not being able to keep the army close. And God, even the Syriac version and the Coptic version, they actually throw this, it was even wild beast in the woods. And God just turned all of nature against these rebels, all in the favor of His Son David. My friend, you'll never waste your energy or your time trusting Christ. I promise you, you will never waste a tear that you weep to God, not against Him. It's not crying because, God, what you doing to me? It's putting my tears and say, God, I'm trusting you. You will never be disappointed by coming to God with a contrite and broken heart, my friend. He loves that stuff. When you do, my friend, you trust God, He goes to work for you. You stand back at a great victory and you see what God does. And it will be because not you fought for God, it will be because He was fighting for you. Let's close in prayer.